And at that moment, there's nothing you can do about it. Are you ready? And he was just sharing, are you ready to see that God? Because we are all going to face him any moment. It'll be the most terrifying moment of our lives. We are going to see him. And so he's preaching to this group of people at a funeral. And then he says it again. He says, you never know when God is going to take your life. And at that moment, there's nothing you can do about it. Are you ready? Then after he shared, he sits down and falls over and dies. In the middle of a funeral. That was just, when the paramedics came, they tried to bring him back to life. Man, I thought, wow, he just said you never know when God's going to take your life. Then he sits down and dies. I thought, wow, what an amazing illustration. But I remember getting a call in my office and someone told me the story. I'm like, what? Because it had just happened. So I went over to their house and, they were just getting back from the funeral and his wife comes out of the car and she's just sobbing. Saying, my husband, he's gone. And then her son's big guy, John, comes up and he's crying. He comes up to me, he goes, did you hear about my dad? And I said, yeah, I heard the story. And he looked at me and he goes, I'm so proud of my dad. He goes, my dad died doing what he loved doing most. He was telling people about Jesus. And then he goes into the house. All these family members rush into the house and they are just crying because they can't believe what they just saw. And so when I walk in the house, they look at me and go, Francis, would you say something to us? And I remember at that moment, the first verse that came to my mind was Matthew 10, where in verse 32, I shared with Michael, what God says, what Jesus says is everyone who will confess me before men, I will confess him before the Father in heaven. But if you deny me on earth before men, I will deny you before my Father in heaven. And as everyone's crying, I'm saying, you guys, you know what this verse is saying? He says, if we will speak up for Christ on this earth, then one day when we see God, Jesus will actually speak up for us and confess us. But if we deny him, he'll deny us. And I said, you guys, can you imagine? I go, try to imagine what it was like for Stan Gerlach today. Think about it. 1 second, he is on the earth looking at a crowd of people. And he is saying, this is who Jesus Christ is. 1 second later, he's standing before God, and Jesus is going, Father, this is who Stan Gerlach is. I go, he had Jesus confessing him before the Father. What did that feel like? And the whole family, they just imagined what that must have felt like for him. 1 second confessing Jesus, and 1 second later having Jesus confess him before the Father. And I remember leaving that day going, oh man, I want to die like that. I'll probably say something stupid and then die. But he, for the last words of his mouth being the gospel. And then he stands before a holy God. You see, I wrestle because when I began studying the Bible, and I try to read through the Bible every year, been trying to do that for 40 years, just so that I'm always going through and I get a complete picture of God. But I remember the more I read the Bible, the more I was shocked how few people read it. And I realized a lot of times in church, they'll preach the same few passages over and over and over. And I'm going, wow, there's a lot to this God that people don't talk about. I remember when I gave my life to Jesus, and I believe I was sincere, I was just so afraid to approach God not knowing if I'm going to heaven or hell. And when people said that I could have a relationship with him, I could be forgiven, I'm like, absolutely, I want that. I want to be forgiven. I want to know where I'm going when I die. But then when I started reading the scriptures, and I remember a little old lady prayed for me and said, okay, now you're going to heaven. I'm like, oh, wow, cool, that was easy. But then the more I studied the scriptures, I began to understand not only God and how holy he is, but I began to see what Jesus said it meant to be a disciple. He doesn't say anywhere in the New Testament, just pray a prayer and ask me into your heart.